The anime begins in a place called the Labyrinth of the Moon's Reflection, where an adventurer, Rentt Faina, found himself paralyzed after encountering a dragon. He thought it was the end, but later was surprised to realize he was still alive. However, upon looking at his reflection in the water, he discovers that he has somehow been transformed into an undead. Before this incident, Rentt had gotten up early that day because for him, only nobles, wealthy merchants, and perhaps scholars with rule-free lives sleep in late. His studious friend, for instance, forgets to sleep for days when focused on research. Rentt was born and raised in a small town not even on maps and currently is a bronze-class adventurer. Like every adventurer, he wakes up early to get good jobs at the Adventurers Guild, which offers tasks based on everyone's skills and class, including monster extermination, escort plant and material collection, and even clearing clogged ducts. Rentt greets some adventurers at the guild, reviews the day's jobs, but not finding any interesting, decides to continue exploring the labyrinth of the moon's reflection, as he used to do. Unlike most adventurers, Rentt worked alone, not being very skilled, belonging to the second lowest class despite being an adventurer for 10 years, counting training before that, totaling 20 years. Despite this, he managed to make a living by hunting monsters and selling magical stones and other materials to the guild, being cautious and having an emergency fund. And so, Rentt stops by the market to buy bread and then heads to the labyrinth of the moon's reflection. However, unlike other times he entered to explore, that day he found a secret passage, getting excited about the discovery and the idea of exploring an uncharted area, acting without any prudence, something essential for any adventurer. He explores the place hoping to find magical items and valuable weapons, but thinks he should earn some money at the guild just by reporting that secret passage. However, instead of going back, Rentt moves forward, ignoring the fact that he is entering a very suspicious and dangerous area. As we know, instead of finding valuable items and weapons, he comes face to face with the biggest monster he has ever seen, recognizing it as a dragon, although he had never seen one before. According to legend, dragons are creatures that can have many forms and sizes, and when Rentt faces such a monster, he can't move his body, being paralyzed because he knew that a simple solo adventurer of the bronze class wouldn't be able to face such an exceptional creature as a dragon. And so he becomes an undead and immortal monster, although easily destroyed by a bishop or priest through purification magic, due to being a creature that violates the divine providence that the dead should not remain in that world. Rentt wonders if that meant he had died, but since he still had consciousness and memory, he decides to keep hope and return to the city. However, upon further thought, Rentt realizes that it's a terrible idea. After all, an undead would surely be eliminated as soon as it showed up in the city, and despite already being dead, he didn't want to be destroyed. Rentt becomes desperate and unsure of what to do, but decides to stay calm and not lose his head, pondering over something that has no answer. Then he takes his sword and notices that the dragon has disappeared, but thinks it's better to leave that place anyway. And so Rentt continues through the labyrinth of the moon's reflection. These labyrinths are found all over the world and researched by scholars wanting to explain their mysteries because no one knows for sure where they came from and how they work, knowing only that there are various ones of different sizes and are places where magical items and hidden treasures can be found, as well as monsters that appear everywhere. Rentt noticed that the place was empty and deduced it was because the other adventurers must be in the labyrinth of the new moon, which pays more than the labyrinth of the lunar reflection. So he thought he just needed to wait for a few days for another lonely adventurer like him to appear with whom he could converse. However, with this, Rentt realized that being a skeleton, he couldn't speak at all. At that moment, another undead appeared, but it was just a monster like any other. So Rentt prepared to face the creature, but he realized that due to the lack of muscles, he was much weaker and would lose even to an ordinary person. Because of this, Rentt decided to face the skeleton carefully, but when he raised his sword, he fell, discovering that in that form he couldn't even lift his weapon. Rentt became desperate seeing the skeleton approach him, but fortunately, the creature fell on its own and lost a leg. The adventurer watched the skeleton trying to fit its leg back in place and thought that obviously a skeletal undead with only bones couldn't use sword techniques. This reminded Rentt that all living beings could use life energy to gain strength. He then activated his spiritual energy, finding out that he could use it even in that form, gaining enough strength to use his sword, returning to the fight just in time for the skeleton to fit its leg. And so Rentt easily defeated his opponent with a sword strike. Suddenly, a light appeared, illuminating the adventurer and the skeleton, and he realized he was recovering the spiritual energy he had just used. This reminded Rentt of a conversation he had with his friend. She said that monsters have a mysterious characteristic and that with time and experience they grow even more. The adventurer observed that humans also evolve as they gain experience, But his friend clarified that the scale is different, giving an example of a skeleton that in rare occasions can become ghouls, a process called existential evolution, one of the subjects she usually studies. Ghouls are also undead, with the difference that they have flesh and are more similar to humans, making Rentt think that with a cloak and a mask to hide his new form, he could possibly return to the city. And so Rentt sets a new goal, to become a ghoul, for which he needed to defeat monsters in the labyrinth until achieving existential evolution. Meanwhile, his researcher friend gives up waiting for Rentt and decides to make dinner alone. The adventurer continues defeating skeletons in the labyrinth, improving his mobility with the light, which he deduces has a healing effect, allowing him to use his spiritual energy in every fight. Then Rentt decides to try facing a slightly stronger monster. After searching a bit, he finds a slime, a creature weak like skeletons, but not to be underestimated because physical attacks are less effective against amorphous and liquid monsters, like it easier to defeat with magic. However, he doesn't have enough skill to use attack magic, so the most he can do is use utility magic to create fire. That means Rentt has to defeat the slime only with physical attacks. For this, there are two options: hit the creature's core or shred its liquid form to the point where it can't regenerate. However, he neither has the strength nor the skill for that, leaving only the option to spend his reserve of spiritual energy once a day, making the small slime almost like an archenemy for Rentt. The monster tries to attack, but the undead dodges, and luckily, Rentt hits its core on the first strike. Then he takes the magic stone and collects the slime's liquid in a flask because the monster can release an acidic bomb. However, after they are defeated, the acid disappears from their bodies and the liquid leaves the skin smooth, making the content usable for cosmetics. Rentt gathered all the liquid using various vials he carried with him and thought that everyone should pay for a few days at the inn. The next day, a girl named Sheila, who worked at the Adventurers Guild, carried out her duties as usual. A teammate asked if the new adventurer who had come by had managed to find a group because, based on the recommendation letter, she didn't seem to have much real experience despite being skilled with a sword. Sheila explained that there were no good openings for the girl, so she thought of asking for Rentt's help. However, since he didn't show up, she told the novice that she would introduce her to a considerate veteran if she waited for a few days. But as the girl mentioned needing money, Sheila informed her about the Labyrinth of the Lunar Reflection. The man thinks Sheila did well because, being skilled with a sword, the girl should manage well in the labyrinth, even as a novice. Sheila cautioned her not to overdo it. Her teammate found it strange that Rentt hadn't shown up and asked if he had taken any long-term jobs. Sheila denied it, explaining that there was nothing that would make the adventurer leave Malt. Meanwhile, Rentt noticed that he no longer felt the desire to eat or sleep, which made sense as he was now undead, and attempting to eat would only result in the food falling to the ground. He observed that despite facing many monsters, existential evolution takes time. Although his abilities had decreased when he transformed into a skeleton, he was almost back to his previous level, thanks to the defeated monsters. Rentt discovered that, in addition to his spiritual energy, he could also use mana and divine energy, even as an undead. He used the energy on the bread he bought in the city because, besides healing wounds and illnesses, it was useful for purifying water and slowing down the decay of food, allowing the bread to last for at least 3 more days. Hoping that after this time he would have a body that needed nourishment, Rentt decided to focus on achieving existential evolution by defeating monsters gradually and safely. He could handle up to 2 at the same time, but a group of 3 would complicate things, and if there were 4, he would have to flee. A group of 5 would be almost impossible to encounter in the labyrinth. Rentt hoped not to encounter such a large group since, in that case, it would be his end, as he lacked strength in spiritual and divine energy and had little mana. Despite not being naturally inclined to be an adventurer, he didn't give up, unlike most people who tend to leave the adventurer's life after a few years and return to the village for fieldwork or other tasks. Rentt trained hard every day, studied magic and monsters with his friend, and accepted any job, no matter how small, believing he would achieve his dream as long as he survived. 10 years later, he was still far from becoming a mithril-class adventurer, a class that had saved nations and surpassed gold and platinum levels, even eluding those with innate talent. Nevertheless, Rentt refused to give up on his dream, even though he had become a skeleton. So he faced the labyrinth monsters again, realizing he was stronger than when he was human. He encountered a slime, dodging its attacks and easily hitting its core, reinforcing his belief that he was getting stronger. Rentt decided to collect more materials to sell, thinking he was fortunate to find another clean slime because they become disgusting after absorbing something, making it impossible to sell the liquid in those cases. But suddenly, the light appears, causing Rentt to absorb his spiritual energy once again. However, unlike the previous times, he begins to feel something strange, and before he knows it, he was gaining flesh. Finally, Rentt manages to undergo existential evolution and becomes a ghoul, acquiring an appearance similar to that of a zombie, which he considers a significant advancement. Rentt thinks that if he keeps striving, perhaps he'll become an undead of a higher class, like vampires who are practically indistinguishable from humans. So now that he has more than just bones, Rentt attempts to speak, but all he manages are some strange sounds. However, he doesn't get discouraged and continues training. Rentt continues hunting monsters in the Labyrinth of the Lunar Reflex to level up. Now that he has become a ghoul, he targets creatures that usually roam in groups, such as goblins. He separates them through the rooms and corridors to avoid complications. With his new form, Rentt has gained muscles, yet he remains even more agile than when he was just a skeleton. His mana and spiritual energies have increased, allowing him to strengthen his sword and easily eliminate 2 goblins. In another part of the Labyrinth of the Lunar Reflex, a girl faces off against a skeleton with her sword. Rentt observes her from afar, realizing he hasn't seen a human in a long time. He decides it's best to stay hidden because his appearance would likely provoke an attack or escape. The adventurer notes that he doesn't know the girl and deduces that she must be a novice. He knows most adventurers in Malt, but since they can be difficult to deal with and often make fun of weaker individuals like him, knowing everyone's abilities and friendships makes things easier. Rentt continues to follow the girl from a distance, realizing that at least the guild must find him useful since, despite his weakness, retirement hasn't been recommended. The girl keeps exploring the labyrinth, and Rentt recognizes that her chosen direction isn't the safest, becoming concerned for her safety. Suddenly, a skeleton appears and attacks the girl. She defends herself, and Rentt notices that she received proper training but is still weak, needing many strikes to be effective. He deduces her fighting style involves dodging attacks and gradually defeating opponents. Observing that the girl isn't paying attention to her surroundings, Rentt sees her getting cornered. Despite the challenging situation, she refuses to let a skeleton defeat her and attacks with her sword. However, her opponent grabs her weapon, leaving her completely unprotected. With no other option, Rentt decides to save the girl. He attracts the enemy's attention, hoping she takes the opportunity to attack. However, he realizes she's too surprised to do anything after seeing a ghoul, so he attacks, splitting the skeleton in half, and then introduces himself to the novice. She panics upon seeing the ghoul approaching. Rentt reassures her, explaining that he won't harm her, and releases his sword to prove his intention. Only then does the girl realize the ghoul is speaking. Rentt seizes the moment to reintroduce himself and clarifies that he is an adventurer like her. She's surprised and attempts to repeat his name until understanding that she is Rentt. Confused about why an adventurer looks like that, she questions if it's some kind of disguise. Rentt explains that he actually died but continues to exist in a certain way. The girl notices that the ghoul doesn't seem like a regular monster and thanks Rentt for saving her life. He responds that adventurers should look out for each other. She explains that despite not wanting to, she needs to ensure he will try to attack her when leaving. Rentt makes it clear that he has no intention of harming her, but explains that he needs help. He tells her that he needs clothes to be able to return to Malt, and the girl understands that he needed something to cover his body and suggests a tunic. So Rentt hands over the money he still had saved and explains that she can buy the clothes and keep the remaining money. The girl agrees to help the ghoul adventurer and introduces herself as Rena Rupage, promising to repay the favor for him saving her life. And so she leaves the Labyrinth of the Lunar Reflex, giving her word that she will return soon. But Rentt notices that the girl was still very attentive to him, as an adventurer should act in the presence of a ghoul, and that anyone would report a strange monster like him to the guild as soon as possible. However, Rentt hopes she won't betray him and thinks that even if it happens, he'll find a way to handle it. After leaving the labyrinth, Rena goes to the guild where she meets Sheila, who is relieved to see the newcomer, explaining that she was worried when she didn't return after sunset. Rena says that a lot happened and that she has a question to ask her, but it's not revealed what the girl asked. Later, Rentt faces another slime and realizes again how much stronger he is now than when he was human, easily hitting a monster's core. He observes that his vision also seemed better, but deduces that it would be combat intuition, something not learned through training or study. The adventurer wonders if that's how the victorious see the world and reflects that it was necessary to become a ghoul to achieve this power. At that moment, Rentt hears someone calling him and realizes that indeed Rena has returned with the clothes as promised. He appears, and the girl is worried that he might be another ghoul, but the adventurer explains that ghouls don't appear in the early levels. She is relieved and notes that Rentt has improved his way of speaking, and he explains that he has been practicing. Then Rena shows that she bought the clothes and brought his change. Rentt approaches, but this puts the girl on alert. She realizes what she did and apologizes for still being scared, asking for a little more time to get used to his appearance. Rentt understands the situation and says he'll just look at the clothes. In doing so, he is impressed with what she brought. Rena chose a simple colored tunic to not stand out and that covers the whole body, similar to what mages usually wear. The girl is happy that Rentt liked it and mentions that she brought other things she thought would be useful for him, explaining that as she recently arrived in Malt, she had to ask someone from the guild to introduce her to the store's items. Next, Rena shows that she bought gloves and boots so that he could cover his hands and legs. Rentt is touched by her kindness, feeling like he could cry, but physically it's not something possible for his current body. Then he tries on the clothes and notices that it's easier to move than he thought, losing only a bit of visibility, but nothing that would prevent him from hunting 1 or 2 monsters. Rena comments that Rentt looks much more imposing that way, almost like a wight, and shows his reflection through a small mirror. But he observes that he will still attract a lot of attention if he appears in the city. After all, his face is visible. That makes Rena remember that she also bought a mask because she foresaw that he would need it. Rentt thanks her, and he analyzes the mask while she explains that when she first saw him, she thought he was some kind of rare monster, and Rentt comments that maybe she was right. Then he puts on the mask, but notices that it's stuck to his face in a way that wasn't normal. He tries to take it off but can't, and Rena apologizes, explaining that the item caught her attention right away, but she found the price strange. Rentt asks if the mask wasn't a guild recommendation, and Rena explains that she found it at a stall selling it for a surprisingly cheap price, only 3 bronze coins equivalent to 3 loaves of bread. The girl mentions that she even checked if the mask had any curse, but as nothing happened with her touch, she thought it was safe to buy, realizing now that she was wrong because the curse is activated only when you put it on. Rentt thinks he's really unlucky and tries to remove the mask with his divine energy, thinking that as his energy increased, maybe he could remove a basic curse. However, despite some reaction, it wasn't strong enough to take off the mask. Rena feels guilty for what happened and apologizes for bringing a cursed item. Rentt reassures the girl, explaining that he really needed a mask anyway, and since she reacted to his divine energy, he just needs to save money and ask a powerful cleric to break the curse. He approaches Rena to touch her shoulder, but thinks it's better not to do that. However, she holds his hand, preventing him from pulling away, and explains that she understands he's not a bad person and therefore is no longer afraid. Rentt thanks Rena but explains that she doesn't need to force herself and can wait for the day when she's really more accustomed to his appearance. She agrees and says she's sure that day won't take long to come. Later, they both return to Malt together in a carriage. There, Rena reveals that she registered as an adventurer in the capital's guild, but since there were already many famous adventurers there, she realized there wasn't much work for a newcomer like her. That's why they recommended she register in Malt, as it's a place with 2 labyrinths nearby. Rentt says it was a good choice, but is surprised that Rena got excited about moving to the countryside. She explains that she wanted to see the world get stronger and become a respected adventurer. He understands the feeling, but says it's better to be a coward since you only have 1 life. Sometime later, they arrive in Malt, but Rentt is hesitant to pass through that entrance because many people there already know him, and they would sense something is wrong when he shows his identity. Because of this, Rena suggests they go through the West Gate, a less used entrance. However, Rentt thanks her, acknowledging that without her, he wouldn't be able to get there. However, even though he needed help, he wanted to separate to avoid causing problems for Rena. If she were caught helping a monster enter the city, she would be considered a criminal and lose her adventurer license. Rena says she understands the danger she was taking in helping a ghoul, but she knew she was only alive thanks to him, and therefore saw no problem in risking herself to help him. As the girl insists, they both head to the West Gate. There, they display their night identities to the guards, but one of them notices Rentt's appearance and orders him to remove his mask. Quick on her feet, Rena explains that she is cursed and can't take it off. The guard inquires if that's why he talks strangely, and she clarifies that Rentt was severely injured after battling a monster. The boy plays along, showing his ear to the guards since his zombie-like appearance makes it seem as if he's wounded. Rena fabricates that he bought the mask to conceal the scars, unaware of the curse. They marvel at how unlucky the guy is, and Rentt suggests they can try to take off the mask if they want. So after Rena assures them it's safe to touch, one of the guards attempts to pull the mask, realizing they were telling the truth about the curse, and they agree to let Rentt pass. The knight thanks Rena once again for helping him but seizes the first chance to evade her, leaving her alone because he still doesn't want to bring trouble to her. Rena searches for Rentt everywhere as he observes her from afar, analyzing that her equipment is cheap but well-maintained. She's skilled with the sword, very intelligent and courageous, making him certain that the rookie will become a great adventurer, despite others with such talents leaving him behind. Rentt contemplates apologizing for leaving Rena alone when he achieves a slightly more human appearance, feeling guilty for having to do so. And so he continues his journey alone, reaching his friend's house because he needed someone who also has a past and whom he's confident will keep his situation a secret. Rentt tries knocking on the door, but with no response, he enters the house and finds his friend Lorraine sleeping peacefully. He wakes her up and she startles at the sight of Rentt with a mask. He He then removes his glove to reveal his ghoul hand. Next week, we'll have more of this anime as soon as the new episode is released, so go ahead and subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to hit the like button below to support this video. See you guys.